This morning, the Princess of Wales returned to the world stage, her first international trip since cancer treatment, alone, as a kind of personal mission to get to know a cause close to her heart. Thousands of people gathered in the streets, leaning out of windows to watch her pass by, and there she was, greeting some of her little admirers. 7 minutes ago, a single sentence, spoken inside a private room in the palace, dispelled months of anguish. Princess Catherine's doctor confirmed that the treatment had produced what the healthcare team described as an extraordinary recovery. William did not celebrate immediately. He lowered his head, held the edge of the table firmly, and asked the doctor to repeat the words. For a family that had prepared for anything but this, the improbable suddenly became real. But the announcement carried implications that had not yet been considered. Before we get into what this means for the royal family, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any updates. Catherine watched the doctor slide the medical report across the table. The document contained independent assessments, each ordered to ensure that hope was not confused with certainty. The Princess of Wales, wife of the future king, and expected woman at the crown's side, had spent months away from her public duties, leaving her children apprehensive and the palace aware of how much they depended on her presence. A premature promise could have devastated the family twice over. William kept his eyes on the report, but he couldn't touch it. The doctor explained that the most recent tests did not show immediate evidence of the threat that kept Catherine under continuous monitoring. He presented the findings through a documented private consultation. Still, she didn't smile. He asked a question in an almost inaudible voice. Could she finally tell George, Charlotte, and Louis that the worst was behind them? The doctor responded cautiously. The recovery had been extraordinary, but it would still require patience, controlled commitments, and protection against burnout. Catherine nodded because she understood the price of false certainty. She had known for a few days that the results were promising, but refused to tell Charles or the children until the senior doctor reached an unequivocal conclusion. The king had his own concerns, and she offered him no relief that might later crumble. William took the summary, reread the decisive sentence, and set it aside with shaking hands. He had spent months preparing for every possibility but this one. Catherine reached out her hand toward him, but he stood up before she could speak and walked into the hallway. The closed door gave him the privacy the consultation room had denied him. When she followed him and placed her hand in his, the composure she had maintained for months gave way. Relief had arrived, but peace? Not yet. For George, Charlotte, Louis, Charles, and William, Catherine's return would reopen fears that had never been spoken out loud. The doctor's words ended a battle. However, as the news spread through the royal family, it exposed the private wounds they had each hidden during her absence. Recovery did not erase what the disease had already taken. Behind the scenes, William had carried the responsibilities of fatherhood, public duties, and constant fear, without revealing which of these burdens hurt most. George had become quieter. Charlotte had begun to observe every whispered conversation. Louis kept asking questions that no adult could answer with confidence. Now Catherine returned to them. But the family she returned to had been transformed by the possibility that she might not return. William had learned to divide each day into parts. The prince fulfilled royal engagements, rushed back to school routines, took medical calls privately, and stayed up after the children fell asleep. Royal engagements were official duties carried out in the name of the crown. But for him, it had become hours of pretending everything was normal. Behind every public smile was a single terrifying thought, that he might one day have to raise George, Charlotte, and Louis without the woman who held the family together. Catherine slowly entered the living room and found her 3 children waiting. She had rehearsed the words, but her voice still shook when she said that the doctor believed her recovery had exceeded all expectations. George stared at the ground, holding back tears as the young heir had spent months trying to look older than he felt. Then he crossed the room, put his arms around her, and admitted that he had been scared. Too much to wonder if she would return to public life. Charlotte didn't move immediately. Relief softened his face, but it soon gave way to anger. The princess had heard snippets of conversations through closed doors, noticed sudden changes in routine, and watched adults lower their voices whenever she entered. She told her mother that silence had not protected her. He had forced her to imagine something worse. Her mother hugged her and apologized, while Louis asked the simplest question of all: did she still need to disappear for days at a time? William responded before the fear could set in again. He promised his youngest son that no return to royal duties would come at the expense of the family. Later, when the children left, he warned Catherine that the public would demand more. The moment the recovery became public, she listened to him, and the future king made his position clear. The celebration could not become a new form of pressure. Charles received the news through a documented call with his doctor and was silent for a few seconds. The king felt the relief of a father-in-law, but he also understood what her recovery meant for the future of the monarchy. Catherine wasn't simply returning to her family. She was reestablishing stability in a royal household that already had its own uncertainties. However, the deepest fear had begun long before the diagnosis. Months earlier, moments before a private family gathering, Catherine had reached toward a chair, lost her balance, and fallen. To understand why the doctor's confirmation felt like a miracle, the family needed to go back to the moment when hope first gave way to terror. The crisis had not begun with a formal statement or a carefully worded note from the palace. It began during a private rehearsal for a royal charity reception, when Catherine stopped mid-conversation, reached for the back of a chair, and suddenly lost her balance. William crossed the room before anyone else understood what was happening. The music stopped, the doors were locked, and within minutes the future of the monarchy had become secondary to the need to save a woman. Catherine was holding notes prepared for a large charity reception in Windsor when the pages slipped from her hand. The event was supposed to support organizations that work with vulnerable families, but that purpose disappeared the moment she collapsed next to the table. William knelt down and called his name, while an aide summoned the medical team. Anne got to the door first and sent everyone out who wasn't needed. The Princess Royal, the monarch's sister, and one of the most senior members of the family, kept her voice steady even as her hands began to shake. William pressed a hand against Catherine's shoulder and asked her to be quiet. When she opened her eyes, she didn't ask what had happened. She asked if George, Charlotte, or Louis had seen her fall. The question cut deeper than the surrounding silence because it revealed where his true fear lived. She wasn't thinking about the reception, the palace, or the crown. I was thinking about 3 children who already felt something was wrong. Anne remained by their side until the doctors arrived. He controlled the room, redirected the frightened employees, and stopped the panic from leaking into the hallways. But the moment Catherine was taken away, the Princess Royal grabbed the back of the same chair and lowered her head. William saw it for the first time. He understood that even the strongest member of the family believed the danger could be real. The first doctor's appointment changed everything. Through a documented assessment, doctors used language serious enough for William to cancel several engagements before the palace acknowledged any health problems. Catherine had postponed previous exams because she attributed her tiredness to public pressure, motherhood, and an exhausting schedule. That decision now carried a terrible weight. Catherine also hid darker possibilities from Charles. She feared that the king was already burdened with his own health concerns and constitutional responsibilities, the formal duties required of the sovereign to keep the state functioning. He believed that silence would protect him. Instead, it isolated everyone. From that night on, every schedule, family meal, and public appearance began to orbit around her treatment. Collapse became the point of no return. William would later discover that she had hidden previous symptoms from him as well. The recovery announcement brought relief, but before he could fully accept it, they needed to face the secret that almost left him unprepared to lose her. The discussion took place without advisors. counselors, or prepared statements. William stood facing Catherine in a private room at Windsor, the recovery report still folded in his hand. He was grateful that she was alive, but furious that she had faced the early warning signs alone. Catherine didn't back down. I told him I was trying to protect him from yet another crisis. His answer came quietly, but it carried months of buried fear. You protected me by excluding me. William placed the report on the table and asked how long she had known. The prince had spent months controlling his anger because the treatment left no room for guilt, only for survival. Now relief had opened the door to everything he had suppressed. He had carried the real pressure, Charles' reduced schedule and the children's fear. But none of those burdens hurt as much as discovering that his wife had suffered in silence alongside him. Catherine held his gaze and admitted the truth. Weeks before the collapse, she had noticed a tiredness that sleep couldn't resolve, a pain she couldn't explain, and moments when her strength would disappear without warning. The Princess of Wales, wife of the heir and woman expected to become queen, had convinced herself that the symptoms would disappear when the royal calendar calmed down. That calendar, the official program of duties, visits, and ceremonies organized around the senior members of the family, never went smoothly. William asked why she had trusted hope more than him. She responded that fear had distorted every decision. Charles was already cutting back on his commitments. The children needed stability, and the future king was being pulled between public duty and private responsibility. Catherine believed that one more crisis would break him. He said the secret had done something worse. It had made him question whether they had actually faced the disease together. Catherine crossed the room and stopped next to a closet. His voice changed when he revealed, through a private account recorded during treatment, that he had written letters to George, Charlotte, and Louis before a crucial medical milestone. She had not given up hope. I simply couldn't bear the thought of leaving without telling each child what I loved about them, what I feared for them, and what I hoped they would remember. William turned his face away before asking where the letters were. Catherine said they remained sealed in a locked drawer. The anger left his face at once. What remained was pain. He was silent until she touched his shoulder, then pulled her into his arms as if recovery could still be taken from them. The fracture between them closed, but control did not return. Reconciliation could heal the marriage, not solve the looming agenda. Beyond that room, doctors, palace officials, and Charles were preparing to decide what the public would know and how quickly she would reappear. And some of them could override even William's will. An extraordinary recovery did not automatically restore Catherine's freedom. Within hours, doctors, private secretaries, security officials, and senior royals met to decide how much should be released and how quickly it should be returned. William wanted caution. Palace planners saw an opportunity. Charles understood both sides. In the center was Catherine, listening as others debated their future, until she pushed aside the meeting documents and reminded everyone that the life under discussion was hers. Catherine was sitting next to Charles when a senior aide proposed a grand public appearance in a few days. The sovereign's office, the team that manages the monarch's official agenda and communications, wanted a moment strong enough to reassure the country. The doctor controlled the clinical recommendation, but the palace staff controlled the entire structure around any return. This division mattered because one side measured healing, while the other measured trust, stability, and the monarchy's need to appear solid. William interrupted the discussion before the advisor reached the last page. The prince rejected any timeline that would turn his wife's recovery into a public relations opportunity. I had watched her lose strength, hide pain, and go through treatment with difficulty. Now he feared that celebration would turn into pressure, and pressure would turn into another kind of risk. The doctor supported him, warning, through a documented clinical report, that exhaustion and emotional stress could still reverse the progress everyone was praising. Charles took off his glasses and studied Catherine's face. The king understood why the advisors wanted certainty. Her absence had left charities waiting, ceremonies emptied, and the future of the royal household exposed in a time when his own reduced schedule had already raised concerns. Still, he noticed how she had stood still while others spoke for her. She put the documents aside and asked the only question that mattered. What did she want? Catherine responded without hesitation. It would return gradually. The Princess of Wales would start with private charity meetings, where she could listen without facing the attrition of large crowds. Only then would it consider a ceremonial engagement, a public event linked to royal duty, national tradition, or the crown. She would not allow the word miracle to erase the reality that recovery still required limits. William looked at her and said nothing, but the relief in his expression was unmistakable. Charles nodded and supported the decision, forcing the room to accept that her body was not a palace asset to be scheduled. The senior advisor collected the rejected schedule, closed the folder, and left knowing that weeks of planning had just fallen apart. Catherine had regained control over her return, but victory came at a cost. The palace's expectations have changed. Public promises were canceled, and already tense relations became even closer. The battle inside that room had ended. The consequences were just beginning. The palace expected celebration. Instead, the recovery announcement created a new kind of pressure. Messages of joy flooded the royal offices. Crowds began anticipating Catherine's return, and networks were preparing coverage of her first appearance before one had even been approved. Each expression of affection brought an expectation. Every expectation became a demand. When Catherine saw the proposed schedule full of ceremonies, meetings, and trips, she closed the folder and realized that surviving the illness might be easier than surviving everyone's rush to recover her. Catherine received the revised calendar before breakfast. The Princess of Wales scrolled through page after page of postponed charity visits, ceremonial duties, and public engagements now being reconsidered because her health had improved. A ceremonial duty was an official appearance linked to the crown, national tradition, or public service. Each entry looked harmless in isolation. Together, they formed a return so intense that the life she had fought for was already being claimed by others. Catherine picked up a pen and began crossing out appointments. One disappeared, then another, then almost all of them, until only 2 private charity meetings remained. She told William that the recovered word had made people forget that she was still rebuilding her strength. The prince supported each exclusion, but he also understood the risk outside the room. If she were to decline important events, rumors about her condition could return, and public trust could once again be caught between concern and suspicion. Charlotte overheard 2 employees discussing possible dates for her mother's first appearance. The young princess entered the room before they could lower their voices and asked Catherine if royal duty was about to take her away again. His anger carried fear underneath. She had endured months of whispered updates and ever-changing routines, and now the celebration felt like the beginning of yet another absence. Catherine hugged her and promised that no agenda would be decided without considering the children first. Tensions rose later that day when a senior aide argued that the monarchy needed Catherine's visibility. Anne responded before William could speak. The Princess Royal said the institution could not be protected at the expense of exhausting the person on whom it depended. He reminded the room that duty without judgment becomes cruelty, and that the crown would gain nothing by forcing a premature return. William watched Catherine absorb every word. He knew that doctors could recommend limits, courtiers could shape appearances, and headlines could demand certainty, but none of them could decide what his family should become after fear had transformed it. Catherine closed her diary and looked at him. The answer, she said, would not come from a boardroom. With the palace pulling in one direction and the family in another, they turned away from everyone to decide what recovery would really mean. There were no officials in the room when the future king and future queen made the decision that would shape their family. William hung up the phone. Catherine put the proposed agendas aside. For the first time since their diagnosis, they talked not about treatment, succession, or public duty, but about the years they still hoped to share. Recovery, they agreed, couldn't mean returning to the life that had convinced her to ignore her own warning signs. William sat opposite her at Adelaide Cottage, the home of the family that had become his refuge from the pressures of the palace. The house mattered because it was one of the few places where they could speak as husband and wife before speaking as royal figures. No doctors were waiting outside, no aide held documents, no private secretary, the senior official who manages royal duties and communications, could break the silence between them. Catherine took off her engagement ring and slowly turned it between her fingers. She asked if William would still support her, if she permanently reduced her workload, knowing that the decision could bring criticism and accusations that he was abandoning the crown. The Princess of Wales had spent years believing that being strong meant showing up whenever duty called. Now she understood that this same rhythm of travel, ceremonies, and emotional restraint had taught her to ignore the warnings her body was giving her. William responded without hesitation. The prince said survival mattered more than any agenda, ceremony, or headline. He had already imagined a future without her, and no public complaint could frighten him as much as this memory. Catherine looked at the ring and then placed it back on her hand. The gesture was small, but the promise behind it was not. They agreed that no family health decisions would ever be hidden again. William would not bury his fear under duty, and Catherine would not hide her pain to protect him. Neither would accept commitments that would repeatedly separate them from children during periods of vulnerability. The previous life had demanded silence. The new one would require honesty. Catherine chose a single symbolic public appearance rather than a full return. She would thank the country, recognize the support that had sustained the family during the crisis, and make it clear that recovery did not mean abandoning all limits. William agreed to be by her side, but refused to speak for her. The story belonged to Catherine, not the palace planners. The decision came from Adelaide Cottage in a private conversation, but it didn't stay private for long. News of the carefully chosen appearance reached the broadcasters. Crowds began moving toward Buckingham Palace in Windsor, and the family's personal miracle became a national event. By dawn, the recovery was no longer a palace secret. One newspaper filled its cover with 3 words: "Catherine is free," printed above a photograph of the princess smiling alongside William. In Windsor, strangers gathered behind barriers carrying flowers, handwritten prayers, and photographs of loved ones who had faced illness. When Catherine finally appeared, the crowd didn't erupt immediately. For a suspended second, thousands just stared, as if afraid the miracle might disappear if they moved. Broadcasters interrupted regular programming and treated the doctor's confirmation as one of the royals' most emotionally intense moments in years. The palace statement, a formal message released on behalf of the royal household, confirmed that Catherine would resume only selected engagements. This detail mattered because it drew a clear line between recovery and full disposition. It also reassured families facing serious illnesses that hope could exist without pretending the fear was gone. Catherine stepped forward alongside William as white flowers and handwritten cards filled the space beyond the barriers at Windsor Castle. The prince stood close but did not guide her words nor respond for her. It was her return, and he had promised that the palace would not turn it into anything else. Then she spotted a child holding a sign that said, "My mom is fighting too." Catherine stopped. The princess went off the planned route and approached the boy and his father, making the security officers tense before William discreetly signaled that she should be allowed to pass. She listened as the man described months of treatment, uncertainty, and exhausted hope. His response was picked up by nearby stations. "Hope," she said, "needs to be protected, even when certainty is impossible." The child held his hand, and the crowd finally broke into applause. Charles watched the broadcast privately and placed the teacup down without touching it. The king had feared for Catherine's family, but he also understood her place in the future of the monarchy. She could reach people through vulnerability in a way that ceremony never could. When the camera showed William standing behind her, the monarch's relief turned to visible pride. The palace reiterated that no full agenda had been approved. Catherine would choose limited engagements, protect her health, and refuse the old demand for immediate normalcy. Europaea ration became a declaration of survival, not a surrender to expectation. The crowd celebrated his return, but the most profound change had already taken place. The family would no longer sacrifice their health to preserve the appearance of royal invincibility. The true meaning of recovery would be measured at home and in the type of monarchy they chose to build from there. Catherine's recovery did more than return a princess to her family. It ended the illusion that real duty must always come before human frailty. The doctor's confirmation gave William his wife back, the children their mother, and Charles the woman he trusted to help lead the monarchy forward. Still, ultimate victory was not found in ceremonies or cheering crowds. It came when Catherine closed her palace diary, walked towards her family, and chose life over obligation. Catherine's doctors remained confident, but no one within the royal household confused progress with invincibility. The Princess of Wales would continue to rebuild her strength with a controlled schedule, meaning only carefully selected and approved duties based on her health and family needs. This decision mattered because a reckless return could undo months of healing. It also mattered because George, Charlotte, and Louis had already learned how quickly royal duty could steal the tranquility of the home. William changed along with her. The prince no longer believed that resisting meant remaining silent while fear consumed him. He had treated suffering as something to be hidden behind duty, but the crisis taught him a harder truth. Courage sometimes means letting the institution down to protect the people you love. The future king would still serve the crown, but he would never allow his demands to silence an alert within his family. Catherine put her phone away before joining the children for a communal meal. George slowly relaxed, as if finally allowing himself to believe that the danger had passed. Charlotte reached under the table and held her mother's hand without saying anything. Louis looked up and asked the question that carried all the fears he hadn't been able to explain. Would she still be home when he woke up the next morning? Catherine responded immediately. It would be there. The certainty in his voice gave the children something no palace statement could offer. George smiled. Charlotte tightened her grip. Louis returned to the meal, satisfied with a promise that sounded simple, but meant everything. Charles made the final position clear. Through a documented public statement from the sovereign's office, the team responsible for conveying the monarch's official decisions, the king confirmed that Catherine's reduced schedule had his full support, and that no ceremonial requirements or constitutional custom would override medical judgment. He had chosen the stability of family over the appearance of unending royal strength. The miracle was not simply that Catherine had survived, it was that survival had transformed them. The monarchy had stopped treating vulnerability as weakness and began to recognize it as a source of empathy, discipline, and trust. For the first time, the crown did not require sacrifice. He stepped back, allowed a family to recover, and discovered that the monarchy seemed stronger when Catherine was finally allowed to be human. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. Until next time,